Game of the Year winner is Elden Ring!
I don't think it's inaccurate to say that Elden Ring propelled From Software to even higher heights than they were previously resting at. Just look at the numbers alone. It sold 12 million units in its first 2 months on the market. Meanwhile, lifetime sales of Dark Souls 3 sits at around 10 million today. It sold so well, in fact, that for their next game, they said, "F you, we're making a new game in our long dormant franchise, thanks for the money, ass." Elden Ring took the formula that From has been using to the next level, and it was a fantastic introduction to the Souls games for tons of people, but as I've said in its own dedicated video, it's not my favorite from Miyazaki and his team. I would definitely agree that it deserves the award it got, but I don't think I'd put it in even my second place on From Software's tier list. The things that make Elden Ring a proper evolution are apparent to anyone who played it with the knowledge of the previous Souls games, but these positives could easily go unnoticed by first-timers of the series. Most of these additions do a wonderful job in making the game more accessible. It might not have specifically been the goal for some of these inclusions, but they contributed nonetheless. They're all things that make Elden Ring the most free-form of all the Souls games. So let's put them in a fun little numbered list so it'll be easier to digest. Number 1, dedicated RPG mechanics are everywhere you turn, pushed to the forefront more so than ever before. Number 2, the moveset for every character is extremely simple. Number 3, Elden Ring, like the Souls games before it, always had ways around difficulty if you were willing to look. It seems like these days, every game needs a leveling system to keep some audiences engaged, even if the game doesn't really benefit from it. But Elden Ring makes a bit more sense seeing as how it feeds directly into its weapons and ability systems. The player has the freedom to wield a variety of weapons or skills and adopt several playstyles at any given time. You could take a ranged approach with archery or magic, or you could go full-on Ungo Bungo with a heavy weapon. And the only thing you'll need to do is make sure your character is appropriately strong or dexterous. How do we do that? We level up. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of grinding. Yes, here they are, ladies, the virgins I promised. The variety in character builds helped keep multiple playthroughs fresh and every crowd of player looked after. Isn't it crazy to think about how from Demon Souls to Elden Ring, the only thing that has been added as far as the base character's moveset is a jump button? Dodge rolling is the same, light and heavy attacks are the same, and no, weapon arts don't count, they're basically just another heavy attack. This means that complexity of the interactions the player has with the world are via everything else. Bosses, especially today, host some of the most intricate movesets that are out there for these larger enemies. And for there to be so many unique ones in these games, it's insane. But the way around these movesets, no matter the shape, size, or speed, will always be the same. This thing right here. The bosses with these extravagant combos are something to behold, but the way around these combos is typically to press that button at the right time. Even still, it doesn't stop them from kicking me down and calling me names all the time. Bosses or arenas that prove to be too much for you can usually be circumvented in some kind of way, sometimes quite literally by the way of an alternative path that takes the player to another challenge altogether, or getting into the right grind set and fighting smaller enemies repeatedly to just get stronger. There are even a couple of bosses in this series that give you a weapon built for doing absurd amounts of damage to a specific boss. Oh, and how could we forget the online functionality? If you're struggling against any boss, you can literally bring 2 other players in to help you take them down. Or you can base your build around AI-controlled Ashes of War. My point with all of this is, Elden Ring has a lot of things built into its world and how the game is crafted to help you get through it if you need it. It's great at extending that helping hand. But to circle around and get back on track, you want to know what Sekiro does to that helping hand? Sekiro is one of my favorite games ever made, and my favorite by From Software by a landslide. But that's not how everyone feels about it. During the game's launch window, it actually sparked a new discussion online about how difficult games should actually be, and whether or not they should all have some sort of easy mode. Needless to say, Sekiro had its enemies who claimed the game was too hard. But I'm here to tell you, it's not. Now, before you go down to the comments and type your very original and not at all derogatory response to that statement, I'd like to offer a helping hand. I will do this by telling you how much I love you, and remind you how good you are at other games. I say this because all you likely need are some pointers on how to deal with Sekiro's unique brand of everything. It has a very steep learning curve, and unlike our crowd favorite Elden Ring, there aren't a lot of concrete ways around this difficulty. None of those bullet points that we discussed pertaining to freedom or grinding are present at all in Sekiro. Wolf's toolkit is not simple. He has a block and a parry, he has a jump, several defensive moves, some optional moves that actually make a huge difference like wall kicks, a grappling hook that has several uses in and out of combat, and the shinobi prosthetic is the only thing that gives the player any kind of freedom in their loadout. Stealth is typically only good for giving you a shorter fight or less enemies to deal with if you know the specific ways you can use it, because otherwise stealth is just... it don't work so good. And there are far fewer opportunities to get around or ignore encounters that you're not prepared for. There are only a few optional encounters and only a few that can be ignored. Sekiro has things that it demands you learn, benchmarks it wants you to hit before you're allowed to continue playing. And a lot of players unfortunately can't pass these benchmarks, and when they can't pass them, they blame the game. I'll be the first one to admit, Sekiro is far from perfect, don't get me wrong. There are a few bosses that I'm not a fan of and a couple of instances that I think could have used some revision, but no game is perfect. But I think people often try to take Sekiro like the Souls games that came before it, and when they do that, what do you think they attempt in order to get past every attack? They dodge or try to evade, and the same thing happens just about every time. Because that's not how Sekiro works. The game pretty early on teaches you that the golden child is not the B or circle button. Parrying is how you're going to make headway here. Every move that isn't prefaced by a red kanji and that violin screech can be parried. Attacks of all kinds, regular swings from a foot soldier, physical hand-to-hand fisticuffs, giant sweeping moves from a larger than normal enemy, it's all supposed to be pushed back on them repeatedly. And it's not just that these moves can be parried, that is the preferred action for the player to take, because every successful perfect parry damages the enemy's posture. The posture meter is personally one of my favorite game mechanics to have ever been devised. It builds up as the player deflects blow after blow, and once it's been filled, a death blow will become available, emptying the enemy's health bar entirely. It makes fights more than just a battle of attrition to empty a red bar, it morphs it into a race of sorts. The posture meter can recover if the enemy is left alone for too long, rewarding players for adopting the most aggressive playstyles possible. Keeping damage on the enemy is also beneficial because a damaged health bar will inhibit the posture meter's ability to recover, getting slower and slower the more life that's been drained. But easily, the one thing that makes the posture meter work above all else are the special counter opportunities that every enemy type has built into their movesets. These maneuvers build up substantial amounts of posture damage, and this part can't be understated, feel immensely satisfying to successfully perform. The Mikiri counter is good for shutting down all sorts of thrust attacks. Sweep attacks can be jumped over and then kick jumped off of. And then there's the lightning counter, a maneuver that I will still argue is taught to the player at a very inappropriate time. But even still, after you've learned the ability and can take advantage of it, it's extremely effective for posture and health damage. The combination of Wolf's abilities, the enemy's abilities, and the posture meter create a beautiful dance that is perfect for player expression. I genuinely think Sekiro has one of the most interesting combat systems out there, asking players to focus on their offensive strikes but also turn their defense back into offense for the best results. Never giving enemies a break and using every one of their biggest attacks against them. But players have to be constantly searching for better ways to deal with attacks. You can parry that strong overhead attack, but it pushes Wolf back and doesn't allow for an ideal follow-up. It's even more effective if you can dodge at the last second and get a few hits in while they're off guard. For players who can get a hold of these new fast-paced objectives during combat, it can feel amazing. Like you're amongst those who just get exactly what the game wanted you to. Meanwhile, everyone else is writing articles about how Sekiro isn't a good version of a game it was never trying to be. Sekiro doesn't pull its punches when it comes to introducing new players to these new goals. Again, I don't think it explains everything in the best possible way, but when it works, it really does. And it's at its best when the player feels like they've created their own paths around rough enemy attacks. It's very easy to see why Elden Ring was far more successful, and of course, don't take this as me saying Elden Ring is devoid of good challenges. It's obviously an extremely tough game, and saying anything less would just be incorrect. But as I've shown, it's just easier to bypass the game's challenge in some sort of way, other than grind the movesets and push your head against these walls. There are plenty of spells and powerful weapons that can be acquired pretty early on if you make a beeline to them, making it really easy to push over what would have been a difficult boss. And I mean, hey, if you are just that stubborn, you can power level yourself to oblivion pretty easily. There are several spots that give you large soul payouts for minimal effort. Meanwhile, our favorite shinobi has to do things the real way just about every time. Character progression in Sekiro is beholden to unlocking different moves or weapons to give you more options. And the only way to get flat out stronger is by defeating the bosses you'd want to use those boosted strength on. Meaning that sooner or later, Wolf will be planting his feet and whittling down these bosses' posture. Defeating enemies will reward Wolf with skill points you can use to unlock some mostly pointless abilities. Some of these attacks are neat, but the only one I will ever consistently use is Mortal Draw. The attacks always seem to interrupt the flow of the fight, and only a few make for good additions to Wolf's moveset. And in a similar vein, there are a few shinobi prosthetics that make specific fights easier if you know what to use, but I find them to be inconsistent. The firecrackers only momentarily stun specific enemies. I hate the shaman enemies because you basically have to rely on the lapis shield. And the flame vent is great for stunning some of the more feral enemies, but again, it's only a momentary stun. The prosthetic tools are nice to have at best, and at their worst actively distract from the flow of the fight and can leave me vulnerable. The best prosthetics to me are the ones that give the player legitimately useful attacks to use. A long-range shuriken, a spring-loaded spear, or an axe for dealing with certain enemies. I would say that this is the biggest wedge that's been driven between casual Souls players and Sekiro enthusiasts. Elden Ring and the other Souls games can be overcome by problem solving and exploration a lot of the time, but Sekiro has to be overcome by mechanical skill. Understanding how the game is supposed to be played and mastering that playstyle is paramount. It's not for everyone, and I mean, I know a lot of people who never truly clicked with it. My best friend Nick, my friends from the Goodnight groups, some people just can't accept the parry or the advanced mechanics and how much they need to be used. I think Nick describes it best when he says,
"At the end of the day, I feel like Sekiro just has everyone fooled into thinking that this is just your regular action adventure game, but the reality of it all is it's basically like Guitar Hero set on expert from the jump, and your special moves and prosthetics is just like a temporary star power you can use. And at the end of the day, your end goal for Sekiro is just, can I beat this boss without missing a note?"
Josh, who has gone on record as an Elden Ring simp on the path back to the light thankfully, had this to say.
"So I think I've just come to terms with it. I'm glad it exists, but it's not for me. In Dark Souls games, you can basically force the game to play to your will because they give you the options to. You can't do that in Sekiro. You have to play how the game has dictated it to you because it's different than Dark Souls, and it just doesn't suit how I like to play. I don't like parrying. I don't like the way the gameplay feels. I think it's good. I think all the praise it received is warranted and great. I just don't think it's for me."
Matt, who doesn't frequent From Software's games, had an interesting view on the subject as well.
"It's just not a game that I would ever play. I know that I wouldn't have a good time. I would get way too frustrated. I've said many times, I love video games, but I'm not good at them in that way. I don't have the patience to hit my head against the wall to get better at a particular game. Like, that type of challenge in video games, I don't personally value that. Like the repetitive trying to do something over and over again until you finally get it."
And Mike, everybody's favorite boy genius, had very similar things to say.
"It's a good game that I'm really bad at. I wouldn't even say that I'm bad at it. I just haven't really put in much time in Sekiro. I got to the big drunk guy who beat the living shit out of me repeatedly, and I was like, I'm done. I'm good.
Yep, that's exactly where I quit.
Experienced enough of this."
Josh and Mike both told me, essentially, it's not that it's too difficult, it's that it's too different, and I don't feel like learning the systems because I don't want to put the work in, which that came off a little more hostile. I've noticed that those who enjoy From Software's adventures tend to latch onto one or two games that they particularly resonate with. Like, yeah, we can all agree that good game, good game, good game, good game, good game. but we all have ones that we really vibe with. For me, I'd say it was my first Dark Souls game, Dark Souls 3, and Sekiro due to how firmly it grabbed me and then gave me a titty twister. But everyone is different. Some people really love Bloodborne, some people really enjoy Demon Souls. Sekiro is just that one oddball that forgoes pretty much everything they had built themselves on up until that point. No more RPG mechanics, no more simple methods of dodging attacks, no more crazy character customization. For the first time in a long time, they made a game that you can't weasel your way through. And for those who can actually make it through that weasel hole, I think they finally start to understand. Like, my first playthrough was such a different experience than the playthrough I ran for this video. I remember getting stuck on Ishin back in 2019. I had gotten so frustrated that I took my anger out on a poor defenseless cup. It was one of the most intense moments I can remember overcoming in a game, ever. But when I go back to Ishin now, it's not a question of whether or not I'll win. It's a question of how flawless the victory will be. I get hit maybe a few times, but I have his timings and attacks internalized at this point. This is the type of high-level play that comes to you naturally when you're on your 8th playthrough of any game. And to me, this showcases the dichotomy between Sekiro and the Souls games. You can replay a Souls game over and over until your stats and weapons are ridiculous, overpowering every boss due to how the New Game Plus works. But with Sekiro, the power-ups you receive from bosses are so negligible that I don't even think they make much of a real difference. There aren't really any optional bosses to face to increase your strength, so the game will always know how strong you are. The only thing that you really get to choose are your prosthetic tools, which I've explained aren't good for definitively turning the tide of a fight, and the moves I mentioned aren't going to save you either. None of that really matters though. You replay Sekiro to get better at Sekiro. And yeah, that sounds like a no shit type of thing to say, but it's true. The point is to grind enemy movesets, not so that you can eventually be a bigger number than them, but so you can outmaneuver them in your sleep. Becoming intimately familiar with every enemy type is the name of the game here, and my brain has been tainted by this way of thinking. You have the spear guys that are bugged to immediately thrust at the player when they jump, and if you're able to anticipate that, they get an instant posture break. When the headless ape jumps in the air, just stand still and then jump into the air to do a jump kick. The camera will freak out a little bit, but you'll always get the counter. Ishin has a thrust with one of the most strict Mikiri counter timing windows in the game, or using any of the opportunities to take a health bar through stealth in the middle of a fight. Sekiro is just that From Software game that clicked with me. And it's hard. Of course it is, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's much more difficult than the other games I've talked about today. It's hard, but because you're not used to it. It's just a different type of difficulty. The type of difficulty that many of you new fans might not gravitate towards after the freedom of Elden Ring, but it's more than worth it if you can play by their rules this one time. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Also, happy Season 6 premiere. I hope you've noticed all the new assets and everything that's different on the channel. We have a new look because I've hired a couple of different artists thanks to Fiverr. I have been underestimating Fiverr for a long time apparently because I have gotten so many new animations, assets, drawings, and it was all really affordable too, and everybody was so super nice to work with. And I want to offer you, if you like anything you see and you have anything you need for your upcoming project, please check down in the description because I've left links to everybody and everything they did for me this season, and you can feel free to contact them. Also, a super special shout out to Pronalis09 for the thumbnail image. I was going back and forth on whether or not I wanted to try to figure out what I wanted to do through Photoshop or whatever, but I ended up just settling on, you know, biting the bullet and having my first ever drawn thumbnail for this channel. So I'm super happy with the way it came out, and I hope that you are too. I hope you enjoyed seeing it. That's dumb. But I hope you're all ready for a ridiculous year of games and videos about games, because this year is stacked. Like, it's ridiculous and a little unfair of how many amazing games that are coming out this year alone. And we're gonna be starting that off in the next couple of weeks with my next video, which will be on Forspoken. I hope we started off with a bang. You never know. That demo was a little... Plus, I want you to keep an eye out for Valentine's Day, because I'm cooking up a little special extra video for all you lovebirds out there. But anyway, I appreciate you for watching. So thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.